By 1900, baseball had well established itself as one of America's most popular sports. The first World Series was played in 1903. The game was enjoyed around the nation, including in the sparsely populated state of Wyoming, where teams fielded by cities and companies played on a near constant basis, their exploits reported on in local newspapers. One of the oddest of those teams came from the town of Rawlins, Wyoming, home of the Wyoming State Penitentiary. The team was odd, heck, possibly unique, because all of its players were convicts, serving time in the prison for all sorts of crimes, including capital murder. It's history that deserves to be remembered. 1911 saw a significant change in Wyoming. The 1910 gubernatorial election was a strange one. Joseph Carey, a longtime political figure, originally planned to run as a Republican before switching to an independent and finally accepting the Democratic nomination. He ran on a reform platform to break the Republican-backed political machine in the state and won in a landslide, winning every county, the only Democrat to do so in the state until Dave Freudenthal did in 2006. Among Carey's changes was a change in leadership at the state penitentiary. The penitentiary had been approved in 1888, but it took until 1901 for the building to be built and prisoners to actually be transferred there. J.P. Henn was appointed the first warden and started a convict leasing program where convicts could be hired out to private parties, a common system in this period. The leasee was Otto Graham, a Laramie businessman who used prison labor to make brooms. Graham was accused of pocketing funds from the state meant to help care for the prisoners and seems to have made a large amount of money in the enterprise. In the book History of Wyoming, T.A. Larson writes that Carey vehemently condemned the state contract under which Otto Graham received 57 cents per day for feeding the state penitentiary prisoners and received all of the proceeds from the broom factory. In April of 1911, the program was ended, and Carey appointed Felix Alston the warden of the prison. Alston was a well-known man. The Bighorn County Rustler quoted Wyoming Governor Bryant Brooks that Sheriff Alston is one of the best sheriffs in Wyoming, a man of excellent reputation and integrity. As Bighorn County Sheriff, he had investigated the Spring Creek raid, in which several cattle ranchers had murdered sheep ranchers. 5 men were convicted in the murders, the first time sheep raiders had been convicted in the state. Included among those men was George Sabin, sentenced to 20 years for his part in the murders. In 1916, Alston wrote to the prisoners that the mistake for which the prisoner pays the penalty should act as a stimulant to aspire to things worthier and nobler. According to the Wyoming State Museum, he brought books into the facility, provided educational opportunities, and added a physical fitness program for the inmates. He also instituted a program for prisoners to repair roads throughout the state. While the leasee program was ended, the broom factory remained, now directly run by the state. His most famous reform, however, was to create a prison baseball team. Even in rural Wyoming, there were a lot of baseball teams. Newspapers throughout the state reported on city leagues and traveling local teams, who played whenever the weather was good enough to run the bases. Letting the prisoners play ball was a little more controversial. In creating the team, Alston turned to a man he knew, murderer George Sabin. Sabin would be the team captain, and he set about finding players. There was shortstop Joe Gazzardo, convicted of manslaughter for killing a woman at a house of ill repute. Private Eugene Rowan, first baseman, was convicted of felonious assault when he drunkenly entered a woman's apartment. Catcher James Powell was also convicted of assault. Sidney Potter, at center field, was convicted of forging a signature on a check he found. Third baseman John Crowdy was also convicted of forgery. Earl Stone, left fielder, and Frank Fitzgerald, second baseman, were convicted together of stealing 4 pairs of pantaloons from Chauncey Root. Pitcher Thomas Cameron had been convicted of rape, and second pitcher H.A. Pendergraft was convicted of stealing a lot of whiskey from a boxcar. Along with Sabin, 1 other player was convicted of murder, Joseph Sang. Sang played a few different positions, including right fielder, catcher, and shortstop. Sang was a special case, as he was the only member of the team sentenced to death. Born in 1880 or 1882 in Allentown, Pennsylvania, Sang traveled some before he came to Wyoming, where he worked for the Union Pacific as a watchman. His boss was Special Railroad Officer and traveling detective William Lloyd. According to the Wyoming Press, Sang had been fired by Lloyd a few days before August 4, 1910. Lloyd had been in Ogden, Utah, but arrived back in Evanston, Wyoming in time to go to a street carnival with his wife. After exiting their private car, Singh accosted the couple. Witnesses, according to the Laramie Republican, said the trio were conversing in excitable tones while walking through a railroad park when Singh stepped aside and shot Lloyd in the back of the head. His wife Alta fell beside her husband, trying to cover him, but Singh pushed her aside and shot twice more. He then emptied the remaining 3 bullets into the ground and surrendered to authorities. "I beat him to it," Singh is recorded to have said. The shocking murder was front-page news across the state. Singh claimed self-defense. Lloyd's pistol was found on the ground beside him. The shooting was witnessed by multiple people, but most damning was the testimony that he had told several people just before the shooting that Lloyd would either be in jail or in his grave within an hour. The Wyoming Times reported that his attorneys put up a weak defense for the simple reason that they had no defense to present. Worse, it is commonly remarked that Singh might have escaped with second-degree murder had he not testified on his own behalf. Singh contradicted eyewitnesses, said the doctors were at fault in their testimony, and proclaimed that every witness but himself was practically lying. That wasn't a trivial distinction. First-degree murder came with only one possible punishment under Wyoming law: death. Later, Singh would offer a different story, claiming that he shot Lloyd while they were facing each other and that the quarrels between them were not because he was fired, he claimed to have resigned, but over a woman, and that the final quarrel was over Lloyd reporting railroad men for entering a tavern. He claimed Lloyd pulled his weapon first. The jury didn't accept Singh's claim of self-defense. He was convicted in April 1911, and his execution was scheduled for August 22nd. As Singh was taken to the penitentiary, his attorneys appealed, and on July 18th, the Laramie Republican reported that he was granted a stay of execution, pending an appeal to the Supreme Court on a writ of error. Despite the brutality of Singh's crime, he was described as a model prisoner. He was allowed to act as nurse to the prison doctor, and he was instrumental in saving multiple lives when prisoners got food poisoning from sauerkraut left in a pan too long. Singh was also apparently a talented baseball player. According to an anonymous writer's memoirs from his time in prison, Singh received special treatment. He always stood next to the guard's desk when the other prisoners were at the dining table. He stood there with his chest thrown out and leaning back against the railing as though he might be the commander-in-chief of the army inspecting troops. After the penitentiary formed the team, they set about finding another team to play. There were a lot of options. Many statewide teams traveled all over to play baseball. The team Alston found, however, was a local business team, the Wyoming Supply Company Juniors. The most likely reason is that the supply company, run by a D.C. Kinnaman, was already associated with construction work on the prison. The Supply Company Juniors were classed as one of the best amateur teams in the state, according to the Carbon County Journal, making them a formidable opponent for the new All-Stars, as the penitentiary team was called, although they were most often called the Cons in newspaper reports. They played their first game on July 16, 1911. The Journal described it. Up to the fourth inning, neither side could get a run, but then the prisoners ran in 3 scores in the fourth. In the next inning, they got 4 more runs, while the juniors remained scoreless. In the 8th, the juniors got their only run, and the prisoners won 11-1. The game was well watched, with other prisoners cheering them on and at least a small crowd of civilians. A woman watching from a guard tower got hit in the face by a foul ball. Singh was called out specifically, the Journal reporting he played a classy game all the way through. The game was unusual enough that the story was even picked up nationally. The Washington Post published an article titled "Slayer Scores Home Runs" on July 24th, calling the team the Alstons and reporting Singh made 2 home run hits over the penitentiary wall. The game went smoothly. The prisoners made a big barrel full of lemonade and passed it around and put blankets over a clothes rack to make a cool, shady place for the juniors. And in fact, did everything to make our visit a most pleasant one, and there was no one who realized at the end of the game that they were locked in and playing ball in the stockade of a penitentiary. On August 4th, the Journal reported that the warden, to comply with the general demand to see his fast team of convict ball players play, planned to take the team out of the prison to play at the fairgrounds. He advised caution to potential spectators, but added that it may be the only opportunity of ever seeing the team play ball. Another game was also scheduled to be played at the prison. "Be on the lookout for the date," the Journal said. "You will be assured of one of the best games and the oddest game of the season." The next game was played on Sunday, August 13th. The juniors had attributed their first loss to nervousness and told the Journal they thought they'd win in a rematch. The juniors' pitcher, Rich Magor, had injured his arm in a different game, but the Rawlins Republican thought that he pitched a fine game, considering. The juniors batted first and failed to get a hit, but the convicts failed to score either. Both teams scored a run in the second. As the innings wore on, however, the convicts began to pull ahead. The score was 6-4 to the prisoners by the 6th inning. In the seventh inning, the Journal reported, Magger's arm seemed to go to pieces, and the prisoners batted in another 5 runs before the end of the game, winning 11-4. The Republican wrote that the penitentiary's pitcher, Thomas Cameron, was there and over in the pitcher's class. The Journal said the juniors were outclassed. While baseball was going well, managing the prison was proving challenging. In early August, 2 prisoners on a road gang walked off the job. They were recaptured a few days later. On August 15th, guard W.F. Carrick was murdered on the prison grounds, shot through the head. The Journal reported that evidence suggested the killer had been breaking into the prison, armed with a hacksaw that he evidently intended to secrete for someone inside. The killer was never identified. The last game was played at Overland Park to a good-sized crowd on August 27th. Unlike the other 2 games, the papers did not seem to cover this game in detail. No play-by-play or stats are mentioned. It was noted that the juniors did not play up to their usual standard, and the prisoners won 15-10. There are a few classy players among the prisoners, and they all understand the game, the Rawlins Republican reported. The games were popular, but for whatever reason, Alston decided it was time for it to come to an end. Baseball games were popular for betting, and Carey may have written a letter telling Alston that rumors that players or prison employees were betting on the games was a problem. Carey made a major push against gambling in the coming months. Instead, Alston got permission to begin an education program aimed at improving inmates. At first, things seemed to be going well for Alston at the prison. A November 3, 1911 article in the Lander Eagle claimed Carey saving good money, better than Graham, and recorded roughly a 20% decrease in costs to the state. In December of 1911, prisoners even presented Alston with a gold watch. But pitcher Pendergraph criticized the decision to give Alston a watch, telling the Laramie Republican that it is worse today than under the old regime. His leadership was not without criticism. In November 1912, the Sheridan Enterprise said Alston was wrong to allow the convicts to go rabbit hunting with guns, to play baseball outside the penitentiary grounds, to frequent the picture show, and to take the stripes off. Without baseball, Singh would just have to wait to learn if his appeal would spare him the death penalty. His lawyer argued the whole verdict should be set aside, and while he waited, he faced issues at the prison with other inmates as well. At one point, another prisoner attempted to drop a heavy box from a walkway above Singh's head. Singh turned at the last second. In April of 1912, the Supreme Court upheld the original verdict and set a new date for Singh's execution, May 24th. On April 18th, the Wyoming Tribune reported that the gallows, which had remained at the territorial prison in Laramie, were being shipped to Rawlins. There was some hope left, though not much. Carey had pardoned or commuted a number of sentences while governor, and now Singh's fate could only be changed by his intervention. Singh's spiritual advisor, a reverend from Pennsylvania, had been in contact with Singh throughout his time at prison and sent a letter asking for commutation. Carey answered that there are not extenuating circumstances in this case. In cold blood, he took the life of his victim and did not even give him a chance to defend himself. I am sorry for his people, but he who breaks the law must suffer the penalty. A reverend from Rawlins, J. Conrath, wrote to the governor asking Carey to spare Singh for his mother's sake. Singh's mother, Anna, had written even earlier in the summer of 1911, begging him to spare the life of my son. She claimed she didn't want to tell Singh's father, who she thought might keel over dead if he heard. Carey answered briefly that I do not see any excuse whatever for execution clemency in this case. On May 9th, the Rawlins Republican reported a petition circulating by a number of women of the city to secure a commutation for Singh, signed by practically every citizen in the city, and calling him an exceptionally fine man. None of the pleas prompted Carey to grant a reprieve. On May 24th, Singh woke to face his punishment. He spent the night before with another reverend. He was quiet and composed, and held his courage to the last. The Rawlins Republican reported that perhaps he did not live as a Christian man should, but that he was at least a brave man. At 2:45 a.m., he stepped onto the gallows trap. The gallows, originally designed for a young man condemned in the 1890s, had last hanged notorious killer Tom Horn, and were designed so that there was no executioner except for the man himself. As they stepped on the trap, a bucket of water became unbalanced and began to pour. Once it reached a certain point, which took about 30 seconds, the weight dropped and Singh fell. It took nearly 10 minutes before he was pronounced dead. Singh offered as last words only his thanks for the kindness showed to him. I desire to thank all the people of Rawlins who have taken such an interest in my welfare, he said in a statement. He still claimed that he wasn't treated fairly, but thanked Alston and the guards who have in every way treated me squarely. His body was transferred to Pennsylvania, where it now lies. Most of the other players would serve their sentences and leave. Joseph Gazzardo was pardoned for his help in putting out a fire at the broom factory in 1912. But George Sabin, the Spring Creek murderer, instead disappeared while out on a prison roadwork gang in 1913, never to be recaptured. The story of Joseph Singh has attracted some attention over the years, both for the story of his life and the murder that he committed, and for the role he played in the prison baseball team. The existence of the team itself represented a shifting era in prison philosophy, where there was a movement more towards reform rather than just punishment, and Wyoming wasn't the only state to consider it. At around the same time, the prison at Leavenworth, Kansas, created a baseball team. It really speaks to the unifying power of sport that, even for a brief moment, even murderers could enjoy a day at the game. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.